With the Camelot leak landing and Classic Plus suddenly looking like a real thing on the horizon, the conversation about what Blizzard should actually fix is overdue. So in this video, I'm placing all 27 specs into a tier list, ranked not by power or damage, but by how much attention each one needs from Blizzard to feel good and close the gap to the specs that already work. Some just need number tweaks, others need real mechanical changes, and a few need a rethink of what the spec is even supposed to be. If I get a placement wrong, drop it in the comments, I want the pushback. Before we jump in, one quick thing. It's Men's Mental Health Month, so take care of yourself out there, and if you're carrying something heavy right now, talk to someone about it. We're not always great at this, actually saying out loud when we're struggling and getting it off our chest, but it helps more than you'd think. And the people around you would rather hear it than not. All love to you. This isn't a power ranking. Some specs are great at PvP and bad at PvE, and that's just vanilla design I want to honor. Subtlety Rogue not working in raids isn't a problem to fix. That's its identity, and Rogue has combat and assassination for PvE anyway. The specs that need help are the ones with no clear identity anywhere, not good in raids, not good in PvP, no reason to bring one. And the sharpest version of that is when a whole class has no viable DPS spec at all, which is the situation Shaman is in, and we'll get to why. So 4 tiers, S tier is critical rework, A tier is significant work, B tier is moderate polish, C tier is mostly fine. I'll spend the most time in S and A because those are the specs that actually need Blizzard, and move quicker through B and C because there's less to say about a spec that already does its job. Every spec will get new stuff in Classic Plus, that's a given, but this is about the ones most in need of love, so the deeper we go, the lighter I'll go. Let's start at the top. These are the specs that have no clear identity in any content, or specs that fail at being the only DPS option their class has access to. There are 5 specs in this tier, and they are in no particular order: Balanced Druid, Retribution Paladin, Shadow Priest, Enhancement Shaman, and Elemental Shaman. Let's go through each. Balanced Druid is the one everyone points to, and for good reason. It's currently bad at everything. The PvE damage is awful because Moonkin form provides essentially no benefit, the rotation has no depth, and you're constantly out of mana. The PvP side isn't much better because the spec lacks meaningful crowd control beyond what Restoration Druid already brings. The hybrid identity for Druid is supposed to be flexibility, but balance fails to deliver on any of the lanes. It's the worst kind of design problem because it's a spec that exists, but doesn't have a reason to. And here's what's frustrating, they already proved they could fix this in Season of Discovery. In SOD, runes like Sunfire and Star Surge gave balance real damage abilities. Fury of Stormrage made Wrath free, which solved the mana problem in one talent, and Eclipse and Dream State gave the spec the sustainability and DPS scaling it needed. Gale Winds also turned Hurricane from a weak AoE into one of the strongest in the game. They literally took balance from unplayable to a competitive raid DPS spec inside one seasonal experiment. The blueprint exists, the only question is whether they commit to it for permanent Classic Plus, or treat SOD changes as one-off experiments. Over to Retribution Paladin. This one might be the most famous broken spec in vanilla, and for good reason. The mana issues are legendary, the rotation is essentially auto-attack with occasional judgment, there's no AoE option, and the spec lacks a defining ability. You're swinging a two-hander, hoping for white damage crits, with a rotation that feels more like managing buff timers than actually playing a class. The fix here isn't complicated. Crusader Strike needs to exist as a core ability. Blizzard designed Crusader Strike for a reason, and it's been a paladin ability for almost 20 years across the modern expansions. Bring that knowledge into Classic Plus, and there's a specific version the community keeps pointing back to, the old beta Crusader Strike that triggered your seals and refreshed your judgments, because that would let Retribution actually generate mana through Seal of Wisdom and Judgment of Wisdom while meleeing, turning the resource problem into a rotation instead of a wall. Add an AoE option similar to Divine Storm, and the spec finally has a reason to exist beyond single target. The seal system also needs to actually be a meaningful choice, not just pick Seal of Command and hope for procs. Retribution can be a real spec with proper damage and a working rotation. It just isn't right now. Now Shadow Priest. This is where the class DPS floor problem kicks in directly. Priest has Holy and Discipline as healing specs, and Shadow as the only damage spec. If Shadow doesn't work as DPS, then Priest is a healer-only class. And currently, Shadow's actual raid value comes from the Shadow Weaving debuff, which stacks up to 15% increased shadow damage taken on the target and buffs everyone else's shadow casts. The personal damage is mediocre at best. And here's where there's a common confusion worth clearing up. People sometimes call Shadow Priest the mana battery in raids, but that's actually about Vampiric Touch, which is a TBC ability, and doesn't exist in vanilla. Vanilla's Vampiric Embrace returns health to the party, not mana. So the actual reason raids bring one Shadow Priest is the Shadow Weaving debuff for the other casters, and the reason they only bring one is that Shadow Weaving doesn't stack between priests. So how do you fix it? Mind Flay needs to be a real damage ability, not a filler that interrupts itself. The dots need stronger scaling. The Mind Blast cooldown needs to come down, and an AoE option like Mind Seer would give the spec real AoE damage instead of just multi-dotting. Vampiric Touch from TBC should also be brought back as personal damage and party utility, so the spec has more raid value than just one debuff. Most importantly, Shadow Weaving should be designed so it benefits from stacking Shadow Priests instead of capping at one. Enhancement Shaman. This is where Shaman's DPS problem starts. The spec is melee, dependent on two-handed weapons, but the two-handed weapons in vanilla raids overwhelmingly goes to warriors and paladins. Mana is constantly an issue. Wind Fury procs are inconsistent because the mechanic is RNG based, and the spec's signature ability, Storm Strike, doesn't actually function as a signature. The weapon problem is the big one, and the community has gone back and forth on the fix for years. The obvious answer is dual wield from the talent tree, which Blizzard eventually did in TBC. But it's not as simple as just bolting it on, because in a vanilla base, Wind Fury only applies to your main hand. An enhancement's hit rating is already painful enough that dual wield's extra miss chance could make it feel worse before it feels better. So if dual wield comes in, it has to come with the hit and Wind Fury problem solved alongside it. The other option people float, and I actually like this one, is bringing in something like Maelstrom Weapon to give two-handed enhancement, instant cast flow, and a real rotation, which preserves the two-handed identity that's genuinely unique to vanilla enhancement instead of throwing it away. Either way, Storm Strike needs help too. It exists as the 31-point capstone, but with the high mana cost, the long cooldown, and only one extra weapon attack, it never feels like the centerpiece. Make it hit harder, lower the cooldown, drop the mana cost, and give the spec real mana sustainability through auto attacks, since Shamanistic Rage as a dedicated talent didn't show up until TBC. Elemental Shaman. Same tier, but different problems. Lightning Bolt spam with no signature ability. Chain Lightning stuck on a long cooldown, fiddly totem management, and mana-intensive casting with weak scaling. And before anyone says Elemental is great in PvP, you're right. But that only earns a spec a pass when the class has a working PvE lane elsewhere, and Shaman doesn't. In my mind, the fix is obvious. Lava Burst or an equivalent signature spell would solve the rotation problem instantly. The design already exists, so just use it. Mana sustainability through better mana spring scaling or talents that let crits restore mana would fix the resource problem. Chain Lightning scaling needs to be significantly better for AoE situations, and totem buffs should scale with the caster's damage so the shaman feels like they're empowering their totems instead of just dropping them and forgetting. So that's the thing with shaman, both DPS specs are broken, and fixing just one doesn't solve it. The class needs a working melee lane and a working caster lane, not one or the other. A tier. These specs have unclear identity or failed to bring meaningful raid value. But they're not in the worst of the worst category. There are 6 specs here: Demonology, Warlock, Discipline Priest, Survival Hunter, Arcane Mage, Affliction Warlock, and Protection Paladin. Demonology, Warlock. In vanilla, this is just a dead spec, and I want to be careful here because people sometimes import its later reputation. In Wrath, Demonology became a must-bring raid spec because of Demonic Pact, the buff that gives the raid a chunk of your spell power, and even the Felguard, the demon that makes the spec feel like the spec, is a Burning Crusade ability. None of that exists in vanilla. Here you get an Imp or a Voidwalker, no raid-wide spell power buff, and a talent tree that doesn't push enough damage to justify itself over Destruction or an Affliction hybrid. so Warlocks just didn't raid as Demonology, they went Shadowbolt with Ruin or a Soul Siphon hybrid, and Demonology sat there as a leveling and PvP curiosity. The bones of a cool spec are there, the Demon Commander fantasy, it just has nothing built on top of them. What I'd want to see is the spec actually leaning into that Demon Commander identity. Give it a strong dedicated demon to build around, the way the Felguard eventually did, so the pet is a real part of your damage instead of an afterthought. A transformation cooldown like Metamorphosis would give it a signature moment, and some form of demon-based raid contribution would give the Warlock who goes Demonology a reason to exist in the raid beyond personal damage, so the spec has a job instead of just a fantasy. Discipline Priest. This is barely a spec in vanilla. It's a tree with some utility talents like Inner Focus and Power Word, shield improvements, but there's no real identity. Holy is the primary healer spec, so Disc has no functional role of its own. Nobody actually specs into it as a primary build, they just take a few of its talents on their way down the Holy or Shadow trees. There are a few directions here, either commit to the Atonement model from later expansions where Disc heals through damage, which would give the spec real identity distinct from Holy, or merge Disc and Holy properly so the talent decisions actually matter, or give Disc Power Word, Barrier as a raid, cooldown that defines it. The current few utility talents approach doesn't work because no one specs Discipline as a primary build. Survival Hunter is the spec with the least identity in the whole Hunter class. In vanilla, it's basically a utility tree you dip into for a few talents, not something you commit to, because Beast Mastery and Marksmanship both outdamage it and it doesn't have a defining playstyle of its own. The melee survival fantasy the name promises never actually shows up. You're still just shooting things from range but worse. Mongoose Bite does technically exist, but it's a weak reactive proc that only lights up after you dodge, so it's more of a leveling button than a signature. The fix for me is to commit to the trap and survival identity the name is promising. Make traps the spec's whole thing, multiple traps active at once, throwing traps at range, traps that scale with your stats. So a survival hunter is the master of controlling a fight rather than a worse marksman. Turn Mongoose Bite into a real signature button instead of a dodge-gated proc, and give the spec a damage profile, maybe through bleeds, that actually rewards the hybrid melee range fantasy, instead of just gesturing at it. Arcane Mage. Here's the thing about Arcane in vanilla, it barely exists as a standalone spec. Mage raids run fire, or a frost hybrid, and the Arcane tree mostly gets rated for its cooldowns, arcane power and presence of mind, which get bolted onto other builds. A pure Arcane Missiles build is so mana-starved that you run dry long before a Frost Mage even thinks about it, and the consensus is just that it's not worth playing on its own. So Arcane isn't really a broken spec so much as a non-spec, a collection of good talents with no actual identity holding them together. So give Arcane a real rotational core. Arcane Blast with its stacking damage mechanic is the obvious answer. It's the ability that finally made Arcane a real spec in later expansions, and it gives you a reason to stand there and cast arcane spells instead of just borrowing 2 cooldowns. Fix the mana problem with Arcane specific regen so the spec can actually sustain itself, and give it a clear identity as the high-risk, high-reward burst caster, which is what Arcane eventually became and what it's clearly reaching for even in vanilla. Affliction Warlock. The thing about Affliction is that all the complexity is there but the payoff just doesn't land. And that's true even setting aside the old debuff slot cap, which Classic Plus is obviously going to fix anyway. The deeper problem is how the spec actually feels to play. Your damage is almost entirely backloaded. You spend the opening of a fight applying Corruption, Curse of Agony, Siphon Life, all your DOTs, and none of it really pays off until they've had time to tick out. So on anything that dies quickly or any fight where you're switching targets, you've burned all those globals setting up damage that never fully arrives. And then there's the part that quietly makes the whole thing feel worse than every other caster, your dots can't crit. In vanilla, periodic damage just ticks for a flat number, no crits ever. So the mage next to you is watching big yellow crit numbers roll out, while your dots tick for the same grey figure every time. And even when you're doing fine damage, it never feels exciting. So here's where I'd take it. First, let dots crit. That alone makes the spec feel alive, the same way it eventually did when Blizzard added it in a later expansion, and it rewards stacking spell crit instead of making it a dead stat for you. Second, give Affliction a real payoff button. an instant nuke that scales with the number of DUTs on the target, or even consumes them for a burst of damage. Something that turns all that setup into a moment, so the DUT ramp finally has a punchline instead of just slowly bleeding the target out. And tighten the ramp itself, maybe through faster initial ticks or stronger upfront DUT damage, so Affliction isn't dead weight on shorter fights. The fantasy of the patient DUT master who sets the whole room on fire and then detonates it, that's right there. The spec just never gets to the detonate part. Protection Paladin. The fundamental problem here is taunt, or rather the lack of one. Vanilla Protection Paladin doesn't have a single target taunt ability at all. You generate threat through Consecration, Holy Shield, Righteous Fury, and the threat from your damage, which works fine for AoE pulls and off-tanking, but it cannot reliably hold a boss against a Fury Warrior who can taunt, swap, and grip aggro on demand. Protection Paladin in Vanilla is the off-tank class, not the main tank class, and that's a design choice that ages badly the moment raid leaders need flexibility. The single biggest thing is to give Protection Paladin a real taunt ability, Hand of Reckoning from later expansions or something equivalent. Improve the AoE threat profile so the spec keeps its strength on trash, and make the active mitigation more interesting than just maintaining Holy Shield uptime so the gameplay feels distinct from warrior tanking instead of being a worse version of it. These are specs that work and have clear identity but need specific fixes to feel complete. I'm going to move through these faster because individually they're less critical, but collectively they matter. Beast Mastery Hunter has one core problem that the community has complained about forever. In Vanilla, your pet's damage stays basically flat at max level no matter how much gear you stack. You can be in full raid epics and your pet is hitting like it did the day you dinged 60 because pet damage doesn't scale with your stats the way it does in later expansions. TBC fixed this and BM immediately became a top raid spec, so the blueprint is right there. Let pet damage scale with the hunter's attack power, buff pet survivability so they stop dying to every raid AoE, and the whole commanding a beast fantasy finally pays off instead of being a liability you babysit. Combat Rogue actually works completely fine, it's the standard raiding spec for rogues, so this is less fix it and more give it some texture. The gameplay is a little flat, you're mostly maintaining slice and dice and spamming Sinister Strike, and the sword versus dagger choice is really the only build decision you make. A bit more depth in the adrenaline rush and blade flurry windows and more reason to care about your finisher choice would make it feel less like autopilot. But to be clear, combat works completely fine. It could just use a little more to think about. Feral Druid is where the quality of life problems really pile up, and if you've mained Feral, you already know all of these. Weapon damage does literally nothing for your cat DPS. Your attacks are normalized and scale off attack power instead. So your actual weapon is just a stat stick and you're hunting for feral attack power on it specifically. That leads to the manual crowd pummeler situation, where the best in slot weapon for basically all of Classic is a level 29 blue from Gnome Regan with a 50% attack speed on use. And because it only has 3 charges per copy, ferals literally farm stacks of the same low level mace to swap in for raids. Just think about how strange that is, a level 29 dungeon, blue outperforming raid gear, and on some calculations even beating a legendary. And then there's the form problem, you can't drink a potion or pop most consumables while you're in cat or bear form, so you're shifting out, drinking, shifting back, burning mana and time. The fixes are the ones the community has been asking for forever. Give feral real attack power scaling on weapons, so the weapon slot means something. Reduce or remove the manual crowd pummeler grind, and let ferals use consumables in form. None of that breaks vanilla, it just stops punishing people for maining the cat. And while we're on Druid, here's a bigger swing Blizzard could take. Experiment with splitting Bear off into its own dedicated tank spec, the way the Guardian tree eventually became in later expansions. Right now, feral has to be cat and bear crammed into one tree, sharing talent points and stats, and it means neither side ever feels fully realized. A real Guardian tank lane would let Bear scale its own way and give Druids a tanking identity that stands on its own instead of being a side mode of the DPS spec. That's a more ambitious change than the quality of life stuff, so I treat it as something to explore rather than something they obviously should do, but the foundation for it already exists in the game's own history. Holy Paladins is actually really mana efficient, and that's worth saying because people sometimes assume every vanilla healer struggles with mana. Holy Paladin doesn't. Illumination refunds the mana cost on critical heals, so a crit stacked Paladin basically self-sustains, which makes them one of the most mana resilient healers in the game. The real problem is the toolkit. It's single target healing only with no AoE heal at all. The rotation is just Flash of Light and Holy Light over and over, and in raids you're often brought more for your blessings than for your actual healing throughput. So the fixes here are an AoE healing option to give them raid healing relevance, and more talent variety in the Holy Tree so the gameplay isn't quite so repetitive. Leave the mana alone, that part already works. Restoration Shaman is a strong raid healer thanks to Chain Heal, which is one of the best group heals in the game. But the spec feels a little bare bones early because Chain Heal isn't available until level 40. So a lot of the leveling and low level dungeon experience is single target healing wave spam. Get Chain Heal flowing sooner, improve the early game mana situation, and give the totem buffs a bit more punch, and Resto Shaman feels complete from the start rather than only coming online once you hit its signature spell. Restoration Druid has a strong clear identity as the heal over time healer, the rejuvenation and regrowth roller who keeps the whole raid ticking, and that part genuinely works. The gap is burst. When someone is about to die in an instant, the hot toolkit is slow to respond because it heals over time by design. A reliable burst heal option, better mana sustain, and a bit more to the talent tree beyond tranquility would round it out without touching the hot identity that makes it good. Frostmage is genuinely fine. It's the premier PvP caster in the game, and that's a real valued identity. In PvE, it could use minor tuning for its utility and raid crowd control role, but it doesn't need a rework, it works exactly as it was designed to. Subtlety Rogue lands in the same place, a dedicated PvP spec with a clear identity, where Rogue as a class has combat and assassination covering the PvE side, so Subtlety doesn't need to do everything. It just wants light tuning for PvP balance rather than any kind of rework. Protection Warrior is the king of single target tanking, but genuinely struggles with multiple targets, because there's basically no real AoE tanking in vanilla unless you happen to own Thunder Fury. Holding threat on a pack means tab targeting and sundering each mob individually while praying the AoE DPS waits for you, and the spec is rage-starved enough that a bad opening swing can leave you with nothing to spend. The fixes are real AoE threat tools, so trash packs aren't a nightmare, and a little less dependence on rage generation for threat, so a missed shield slam doesn't lose you the pull. Single target boss tanking is already great. It's the trash that needs help. Assassination Rogue is the dagger spec, and it works, it just lives under a couple of constraints that make it feel fiddly. It's locked into daggers to function, and the heavy reliance on backstab means a lot of your damage requires you to be behind the target, which isn't always possible depending on the fight. More weapon flexibility and less hard positional dependence would loosen it up. It's not broken, just a bit constrained compared to combat. Marksmanship Hunter is mostly solid, but gets hurt the most by the dead zone, the 5 to 8 yard range where hunters can't melee and can't use ranged weapons. The dead zone is a hunter-wide problem, not an MM problem specifically, but it hurts MM the most, because MM is the most pure ranged of the 3 specs. Reduce or remove the minimum range, and marksmanship feels complete as a range DPS option. Arms Warrior is a PvP-focused spec, and that's completely fine because Fury covers the PvE damage role for the class. So Arms doesn't need to become a raid spec, it just wants light tuning to stay competitive in the battlegrounds and world PvP where it actually lives. Same logic as Subtlety and Frost, a spec with a real PvP home and a working PvE sibling, doesn't need fixing. C tier. Like I said at the start, this is the quick one because these 4 specs are mostly fine and there's just not much to fix. So I'll keep each of these short, not because they don't matter, but because this already works, doesn't need 5 minutes of explanation. Fury Warrior, top raid DPS spec, gear dependent and consumable dependent but functional. Minor rage generation improvements would help with the consumable dependency. Destruction Warlock. Functional range DPS, mana intensive Shadow Bolt spam, but it works. Minor mana fixes and some AoE options would round it out. Fire Mage. Top rate DPS spec for casters, fire immunity encounters are punishing, but otherwise the spec is in a good place, so minor adjustments only. Holy Priest, the reference point for raid healers. The main thing worth noting is that Vanilla Holy doesn't actually have a smart raid heal at all. Circle of Healing didn't exist until TBC, so Vanilla Holy is leaning on Prayer of Healing, which only hits one party of 5 rather than the whole raid. That gap doesn't make Holy bad as designed, but it does mean Classic Plus might want to consider whether a smart raid heal would round the spec out. 4 patterns explain most of what's broken here. The first pattern is the hybrid tax. Druids, paladins, and shamans suffer the most in vanilla because they're jack of all trades. The hybrid identity is supposed to be a strength, but it ends up being a curse. Classic Plus needs to commit to making each spec viable in its lane. The second pattern is the signature ability problem. Most of the S tier and A tier specs lack a single defining ability that says, "This is what makes this spec interesting." The fixes already exist in WoW's history. Take Crusader Strike for Retribution, Lava Burst for Elemental, Arcane Blast for Arcane, 3 abilities Blizzard already designed for later expansions that would give those specs real identity. Stormstrike, the one signature enhancement already has in vanilla, just needs to be redesigned into something that actually anchors a rotation. Classic Plus can use that design knowledge directly. The work doesn't need to start from scratch. The third pattern is the pet problem. Beast Mastery Hunter, Demonology Warlock, and Survival Hunter all suffer from pets that don't scale or matter enough mechanically. Pet classes need pets to actually be important. Either pet damage scales properly with the player, or pets bring unique utility that other classes can't replicate, or both. The fourth pattern is the class DPS floor. Every class should have at least one viable raid DPS spec. Shaman currently has none. Priest barely passes because Shadow is weak. That's a fundamental design problem, and it has to be the highest priority for Blizzard if they want Classic Plus to feel like a complete game. Blizzard already proved they can do this. In Season of Discovery, they took Balanced Druid from completely unplayable to a real raid DPS spec through targeted runes, and gave Enhancement Shaman the tools to actually function. They showed you can modernize vanilla specs without breaking what makes vanilla feel like vanilla. The runes worked, the class fantasy held up, and the specs became viable. If there's one principle I'd want Blizzard to hold onto through all of this, it's the one the community keeps repeating in every Classic Plus thread. Impactful, but subtle. Nobody wants retail abilities bolted onto vanilla or every spec turned into a modern rotation with 6 buttons and a resource bar. The fixes that land are the ones that solve the actual problem while still feeling like they belong in 2006. Crusader Strike feels like vanilla, letting a cat drink a potion feels like vanilla, a shaman that can actually do damage feels like vanilla. That's the bar. So this isn't a question of capability. It's a question of will. Will Blizzard commit to these changes for permanent Classic Plus? Or will they treat SOD as a seasonal experiment and ship Classic Plus with the same broken specs we've been playing around for over 20 years? Classic Plus could be the version of vanilla that finally makes all 27 specs feel like they belong. The blueprint exists on private servers, and some changes actually made sense in SOD. The demand is obvious in every Classics thread. Whether Blizzard takes the opportunity is up to them. So tell me where I'm wrong. If you've mained a spec I put in S tier and you think it's fine, or one in B tier you think is actually broken, that's exactly the conversation I want in the comments. And if you want more of this once Blizzard announces real details, you know where the sub button is. Thank you so much for watching. Until the next one, take care.